our next and final speaker in the new work in participatory sense-making graduate conference here at the University of Bucharest is Mr. Juan Murillo Vargas. And I'm hoping I'm saying that right. Mr. Vargas just graduated from UW Milwaukee from a master's program, and now he's on his way to a PhD in MIT. Juan, we're delighted to have you with us. And your talk, as I see here, is titled What the QUD Models. Quite interesting, very much looking forward, and please take it away.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, here, let me just share the handout. Okay, awesome. And for starters, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to present today. I also kind of want to give a disclaimer. I'm very much working within the kind of analytic philosophy of language, philosophy of cognitive science tradition. And that's going to be very apparent in terms of what kinds of assumptions I'm making, what kinds of concerns I'm kind of addressing, and what kind of options I think are kind of attractive. By all means, during Q&A, if you think that I should be thinking about the issues in a different way, bring it up. I'm more than happy to hear about other ways of approaching the kind of problems I'm discussing here. Now, the talk is kind of centered around this kind of model of conversation called the kind of question under discussion framework. And so I kind of just want to kind of briefly introduce it. So here's the situation I kind of find myself often in. We're hungry, there's 4 of us, we want to get pizza and we want to figure out where. And here's kind of how the conversation goes. Right? So one person asks, what's the best pizza place near here? And 2 people kind of suggest, one person suggests Sal's, one person suggests Ian's. But then one person who read too much Fodor for their own good says, Wheaties is the breakfast of champions. And the intuition here is that the first 2 replies are kind of good. They're perfectly kind of cooperative. Whereas the last reply is somehow weird. And the explanation here, kind of given to us by Craig Roberts across her entire career, is that conversations are kind of structured by question under discussion. A question that everyone's trying to answer at a given point in conversation. And crucially, kind of speakers ought to kind of proffer assertions only if they at least partially answer to the question under discussion. So in our little toy case here, right, the question under discussion is, what's the best pizza place near here? And obviously, like, giving a pizza place is kind of a perfectly sensible answer to that question. In contrast, kind of talking about Wheaties and the breakfast of champions is sort of irrelevant. Hence why the kind of last reply is no good. Now, this framework is kind of really popular across linguistics and philosophy. I'm not going to read the kind of long list of uses it's put to. But there's kind of very little discussion over what this framework actually is about, what kind of like psychological processes we're actually modeling. In that regard, it's kind of like an outlier compared to another picture we're going to kind of talk about at length, coming from Stallnacher, on which we can think about conversation in terms of shared information, where that shared information is just reducible to kind of which propositional attitudes we have together. Now you might ask, kind of, is this a problem for the model? After all, it's kind of well attested that not every model has a kind of heavy-handed metaphysics ready at hand. So for example, Hazlitt Chang, in his book, Inventing Temperature, talks about how a lot of early modeling and measuring of temperature happened well before we had a kind of metaphysics for what temperature is. And so in principle, like, not having a metaphysics for your model might not seem like a problem. Nonetheless, I think there's very good reasons why we should kind of try to figure out what the QED is modeling. One of them is empirical. So currently, kind of our best way of kind of testing these kinds of QED-based explanations is through exchanges like one, right, where we kind of posit an explicit question and then we see what kinds of replies are available. Most psycholinguistic work kind of likewise kind of requires the QED to be explicit. But as we shall see in a moment, QEDs can be implicit. And we need a way of testing that too. And figuring out what psychological process we're actually modeling can help with that, right? Because we can kind of figure out what kind of psychological processes we need to be testing. Also, I think there's a kind of philosophical point here. So the question discussion kind of model belongs to this kind of broader research tradition called kind of dynamic pragmatics. In dynamic pragmatics, what you basically do is you theorize about conversation in terms of shared bodies of information, right? So you can think about kind of assertions as updating the common ground, which is your shared propositional attitudes. You can think about questions as updating the QED, etc. But dynamic pragmatics is also a Gricean project where the goal is to kind of heed Grice's warnings of not confusing kind of linguistic phenomena for pragmatic phenomena. And you kind of posit public bodies of information to kind of help you explain pragmatic phenomena. But Griceanism is an actual enterprise, right? As kind of Stephen Schiffer kind of points out, the goal is to kind of reduce facts about meaning to facts about psychology. Kind of the classic example is by reducing them to facts about kind of a whole suite of communicative intention speakers can have. But if that's right, and what we're really trying to do is kind of naturalize meaning, the question or discussion better be amenable to this kind of naturalization too. And so my goal in this talk is to give an account of what the question under discussion is. And the talk is going to come in two parts. So the first part, I'm going to lay down some kind of theoretical and empirical constraints. I'll first outline kind of 4 desiderata for like a metaphysics of the QED. And afterwards, I'll look at some work on primate and decommunication to suggest that the question under discussion can't require kind of sophisticated cognitive resources. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. In the second part, I'll compare kind of 2 accounts of what the QED is. So I'll first outline a kind of intentionalist proposal on which the question under discussion reduces the facts about what our mutual intentions will lead us to attend to. I'll suggest it kind of fails because it kind of over demands too many cognitive resources. I'll then propose what I call an interrogativist account, on which the question or discussion reduces to facts about what our interrogative attitudes will lead us to attend to. And along the way, I'll explain what an interrogative attitude is. And what I'll ultimately suggest is that it captures what's right about kind of Roberts's view or kind of the intentionalist proposal without being subject to over-intellectualization worries. And then, if time allows, I'll conclude with some remarks about how to approach models and dynamic pragmatics more generally. So let's get into it. I think there's kind of at least 4 constraints on a theory of the QED subject matter. So I call these reducibility, publicity, relevance, and non-provinciality. Reducibility is just the idea that the question under discussion is to reduce the facts about the mental states of every conversational participant. Publicity is the idea that the question should be public or shared among every conversational participant. Relevance is the idea that the question under discussion should determine what kind of conversational contributions are relevant in a conversation. And non-provinciality is the idea that the question under discussion should be a priori exclusive to humans. Now let me kind of defend each desideratum in turn. Reducibility kind of falls out of the kind of broader Gricean enterprise that I was talking about earlier. Remember, kind of Griceans want to reduce facts about language to facts about psychology. And so the question on discussion should be no different. And I think here comparing with Stollenacker's common ground is kind of helpful. So for Stollenacker, the common ground is just the representing kind of shared information among conversational participants. So the definition he gives, with some bells and whistles, is that a given proposition is in the common ground if every conversational participant mutually accepts that proposition. And so likewise, we're looking for something like the schema, right, where a given question is the question under discussion, if and only if every conversational participant holds some attitude towards some content. We can also stay agnostic on whether the attitude itself takes question sets its contents, right? We don't have to kind of prejudge that question right away. Publicity kind of falls out of the role the QD plays in conversation. Again, kind of Stalnaker is helpful here. For him, kind of the common ground helps interlocutors coordinate a conversation by giving them a shared information base, which they all know and share, right? So for example, if we want to coordinate like which pizza place to go to, having shared information about which pizza places are around us is really helpful for that. And Stalnaker thinks we can model that using the common ground. Likewise, the question discussion is meant to help interlocutors coordinate a conversation by giving them shared conversational goals, which they all know and share, right? So again, going back to the pizza example, it's really helpful in a conversation if we know what we're all trying to do, right? And in the pizza case, what we're all really trying to do is find a pizza place to eat pizza in. I also want to mention kind of a wrinkle here. So at least in kind of analytic philosophy of language, philosophy of cognitive science tradition, publicity was usually thought to require something like common knowledge. So a given proposition was public if everyone knows that proposition, everyone knows that proposition, and so on indefinitely. And so in this kind of picture, like publicity requires like indefinitely iterated representational states. So Stalnaker common ground does this. So a proposition is public because everyone accepts it, everyone accepts it, everyone accepts it, and so on. This way of thinking about what it means for like information to be public is really controversial, starting from some papers by Harvey Lederman and also by Dan Harris and Rory Harder. My strategy will be to avoid the issue entirely and focusing on joint attention. I should also mention, I think this is just the better way of thinking about publicity more generally. So joint intention, at least as I'm understanding it, is when two or more subjects kind of attend to the same content in lockstep with one another. On some views, this is going to require common knowledge. For example, John Campbell's views like this. But in other views, this publicity is achieved by joint attention itself without any kind of indefinitely iterated representations needed. And the upshot of this is that if the QED is public because of joint attention, we just don't have to take a stand on whether common knowledge is required. And I think that's kind of dialectically and philosophically desirable in this case. Moving on to relevance, which is also kind of what makes the QED distinctive. So Craig Roberts follows Carlson in 1982 in thinking that discourse is structured around certain goals. And she also follows Gordon Stokoff in modeling these goals as questions. And the reason why this is kind of a good way of modeling them is because, as question answer exchanges shows, kind of, let me rephrase that. Question answer exchanges are kind of exhibit the kind of goal-oriented structure that we're trying to model. And so kind of simplifying everything to a kind of question answer exchange is actually really fruitful. I should also mention that this kind of falls out of a broader Stalnakerian approach to conversation. So for Stalnaker, communication is a kind of joint inquiry into what the world is like. But what Roberts points out is that inquiries are strategic, right? We don't answer kind of this big question, what is the world like, all at once. We kind of partition it into smaller sub-questions that we try to answer kind of one at a time. And this is another way of saying the model of conversational exchange is an attempt to answer the live sub-question at a given point in conversation, which is the question under discussion. I also want to pause here to note that none of these desiderata require the QD to be made explicit. So Stalnaker's common ground is helpful again. So one kind of situation kind of Stalnaker talks about is suppose a goat walks into a room by surprise and everyone kind of thereby silently and mutually accepts that there's a goat in the room. For Stalnaker, the proposition's on the common ground, right? And that sort of makes sense because we can all kind of coordinate based on that information, right? So, for example, we might imagine kind of people in a situation kind of giving each other kind of knowing looks, or maybe even kind of coordinatedly walking out of the room because a goat just came in. We can also kind of come up with similar cases for the question under discussion. So here's a kind of minimally revised version. So imagine that a goat walks into a room by surprise, and we all silently but mutually wonder, like, why is there a goat here? This question sounds the question under discussion. And we can tell because we can imagine that people in the situation would just sort of turn to each other and start kind of hypothesizing why there's a goat that entered into the room randomly, right? This is kind of a plausible thing that could happen. And the upshot of this is that the question under discussion doesn't need to be explicit. It plays a theoretical role in coordinating conversation. Finally, non-provinciality. Unlike the other three, this isn't something that kind of Craig Roberts defends herself. But it's defended elsewhere in the literature by Philippe Schlenker, Josh Armstrong, and others. So I'll just offer kind of three quick remarks in support. The first is just kind of an epistemological point, which is QED-based explanations in humans aren't established a priori either. Right? We run empirical diagnostics, say by like looking at question and answer exchanges, like we saw earlier. And so parity kind of requires us to take a similar approach to non-humans too, right? There's no good reason why we kind of have a different standard for what like other animals can do. Again, I think there's a Gricean point here, which is that, as long as the QD is meant to be naturalizable, we should welcome it's being potentially present in non-human animals, right? One good way of showing that like something is naturalizable is to show that it's present elsewhere in nature, right? And so if this is your philosophical project, you should be very much happy with the idea that other animals also have questions under discussion. Excuse me. And finally, I think this is kind of important to keep in mind. The question under discussion is first and foremost kind of a theoretical posit. We introduce it to explain how conversational interlocutors coordinate in conversation based on what is relevant. It's not something we kind of like observe out there in the world directly. And so whether the question under discussion is present in non-humans is going to depend on whether we need to kind of find similar phenomena in non-human animals and whether we need to give them similar explanations. Even if that kind of seems counterintuitive, right? That's what it means to be a theoretical posit, right? It's to play certain theoretical roles regardless of which kind of animal we're talking about. And so I think like these three considerations kind of make it kind of very important that your account of the question under discussion doesn't a priori rule out that question under discussions can appear not just in humans, but in non-humans. Saying as much kind of leaves it open whether the question under discussion in fact should be posited in non-human animals. And so that's kind of where I'll turn to next. So my strategy here is kind of going off of this idea that the question under discussion is a theoretical posit, is to kind of look at its theoretical roles, see if we need those theoretical roles to explain facts about animal communication. And if that's the case, we'll be able to conclude that animal communication is also structured by a question under discussion. Based on what we've said so far, there's kind of two theoretical roles that the question under discussion needs to play. So one is kind of this conversational coordination, which we talked about when we were talking about publicity. And relevance determination, which we kind of were talking about when we were talking about relevance. Before I start talking about animal communication, I want to forestall some worries. So one worry, which I've received in conversation quite a bit, is that this just seems kind of super counterintuitive. And I'm happy to grant that, like, intuition doesn't kind of automatically say that animals have questions under discussion. But again, like, so it goes with theoretical posits, right? We posit them not because they're intuitive, but because they explain the things we need them to explain. And so if the evidence suggests that these theoretical roles need to be played, then we should still posit QEDs, even if kind of intuition calls for something else. Another worry you might have is that even if we grant that the QED is a theoretical posit, it seems incredibly unlikely that it's going to recruit the same cognitive resources across both humans and non-humans. And I agree. The communication systems I'll be talking about differ quite radically from human communication, right? So for example, there's no evidence that the kind of symbolic code has compositional structure. You have very limited expressive power. The animals we'll be talking about have limited to non-existent kind of mind reading capacities. And this can lead us to ask quite interesting questions about where and why questions under discussion differ across different communication systems. However, the intended claim here isn't that QEDs are identical everywhere. The claim is simply that they can't require cognitive resources that only humans possess, right? And so we find out that the question under repercussion kind of can be found in kind of animals that don't have all the mental states that humans do, that's reason to think that the question or discussion can't require those mental states. I also want to flag, more on a kind of dialectical note, that these literatures are massive and there's so much we don't know about the systems I'll be talking about. I've just kind of tried to stay agnostic about certain debates that kind of primatologists and biologists have. And so it's kind of, I'm trying to stay open on, for example, the evolutionary history of these communication systems, or kind of what kind of biological mechanisms are at play. I'm strictly speaking focused on the kind of structure of these communication systems. With all that said, let's look at some animal communication systems. And what I'll be kind of talking about here are kind of the systems we find in non-human primates and in bees. Actually, maybe kind of, I want to start just by giving like a brief overview of how like primate communication systems work. So these systems usually involve kind of highly conventionalized calls that are used to inform nearby primates of potential threats. So for example, Campbell's monkeys have a specialized call for when a leopard is nearby. They have another specialized call for when raptors are nearby, and have a final call for when there's kind of just a generic threat in the environment. Vervet monkeys, likewise, have one call for aerial predators, one call for terrestrial predators, and one dedicated call for low-lying predators, which is like snakes, right, where they're kind of directly on the ground. Most of these calls kind of lack recognizable compositional structure. So you will see cases where a primate might kind of repeat a sequence of calls to kind of signal that the predator is really nearby or is really dangerous. But there's no evidence that these primates can kind of put calls together to build a bigger call that's a function of the meaning of its parts. We don't see that kind of evidence. What we do see, however, is that each call is associated with a characteristic response on the addressee's behalf. So, for example, if a vervet monkey calls that there's an aerial predator nearby, other kind of vervet monkeys will kind of hide in bushes because that's the way you hide from an aerial predator. And I think there's kind of good evidence discussed kind of, again, by Philippe Schlenker et al. And kind of a lot of Josh Armstrong's work, that the monkey's call system kind of involves questions under discussion. And to do that, I want to kind of talk about coordination and relevance determination kind of independently. So one kind of thing to notice that primates don't produce calls instinctually, right? They're kind of engaged in a social activity, right? Where they monitor both whether other primates are within earshot and whether those other primates are already aware of the relevant predator. And this monitoring is important, right? Because it allows them to coordinate action. So, for example, if a predator kind of is nearby and all the ignorant members of the group have been informed, again, they will kind of retreat from the predator before any harm occurs. And crucially, this is kind of enabled by the fact that kind of primates kind of monitor each other's responses and each other's kind of information states before they get calls. And this kind of strongly suggests that like there's some amount of like coordination here between how like primates produce calls. And I think the kind of more important one here is kind of relevance determination. So Schlenker et al. Argue that some primates abide by an informativity constraint. So they're looking at like a white Columbus monkeys, not vervet monkeys. But what they found is that when they live in an environment where only eagles and leopards are potential predators, they will use a kind of generic threat call to signal that they're leopards, since the leopard signal kind of by elimination signals that there's an eagle. That the threat isn't an eagle and so must be a leopard. And so the idea here is that the call, strictly speaking, is weaker than a leopard signal, but it doesn't matter because in the given context, if it's not an eagle, it's a leopard. But the crucial bit here is that informativity is a relevant sensitive notion. Right? It requires monkeys to track which predators have threatened them in their given environment. Right? So, for example, we don't see this kind of effect in environments where there are more than just eagles and leopards as predators. Right? That being said, that's kind of controversial. And so I want to point out that there's kind of just a more basic piece of evidence here, which is that calls are produced only when other ignorant primates are around. And the reason is that this suggests that calls are produced only when relevant. namely when the group needs to coordinate the right response for a given predator. To put the point in a kind of theory-laden way, calls are produced only when the coordinated group's information about and response to a potential predator, right? So, again, kind of primates don't produce calls just willy-nilly. They produce it when they need to kind of figure out whether there's a predator and what they need to do to kind of avoid them. And it strongly suggests that primate calls are kind of governed by this kind of relevance constraint. That calls are generated only when it's kind of relevant to do so. Let me now kind of turn to bee communication. I think is kind of a more interesting case, just because bees kind of are kind of one of the more kind of basic cases of social kind of communication we find in nature. So again, let me start with just kind of a brief kind of overview of how the system works. So bees have kind of rigid social categories, right? So there's foragers, there's queen bees, there's unemployed bees, which are kind of funny. And only foragers kind of go out to search for potential food sources, produce what gets called the waggle or the bee dance. And now the system is symbolic, right? Each dance pattern represents different information about a given food source, right? So for example, bees might produce a kind of dance in the shape of an 8 when there's a food source nearby. When there's a food source kind of longer away, they might produce a more convoluted pattern to kind of signal that there's food but is farther away. Again, kind of the system isn't recognizably compositional, right? While dances can be kind of modified based on how far the food source is or how many resources there are, dances can't be put together into a bigger dance whose meaning is composed of its parts. And again, I think the evidence makes it plausible that bee dances involve QEDs. And here, for kind of an introduction to this kind of literature, Carl Frisch's work, Thomas Seeley's work, and this kind of more recent review article by Janssen and Price and Ruder are kind of helpful. And let's just run through our theoretical roles again. Once again, bees don't produce or respond to dances instinctually, right? They kind of moderate their kind of dances based on what other bees are present and what other bees are signaling. So for example, if a kind of forager enters the dance floor, signal that a food source is nearby, other foragers who are also acquainted with that food source will join the dance. Likewise, the kind of dance helps coordinate whether and how many foragers will go out to that food source. And in particular, different foragers will go based on how far away the food source is. And so, for example, if it's been signaled that the food source is nearby, fewer foragers will come in. But if the signal is modified so that it turns out that the nearby food source has a lot more resources than kind of initially thought, more foragers will join in. And there's a kind of sensitivity to information that, again, helps kind of coordinate bees' foraging efforts. Again, for relevance determination, there's this point that foragers don't produce these dances very often. They only produce them when they find a food source and need to kind of coordinate with other foragers in order to harvest it. I think a better piece of evidence, though, is that some bee dance systems include a stop signal. And the system is an anti-waggle, right? Among its kind of uses is that a forager might use it to kind of counteract another forager's dance, providing a negative signal about the food source being kind of discussed. So for example, suppose that there's a bee signaling that there's a food source nearby, and then a forager comes in and kind of notices that and kind of knows that that food source doesn't have as many resources as are being signaled. The way the stop signal works is the bee will kind of tense its wings and bump into the bee kind of signaling the food source. And the message that sends is that the food source isn't as bountiful as the other bees signaling. And the crucial point to notice about this is that foragers produce this kind of stop signal only when we kind of have information about the kind of food source being signaled and have updated information about it. And the reason why this is important is because that means that they're kind of tracking which particular food source is at issue, and they're kind of producing a stop signal accordingly. Again, precisely because kind of what the kind of waggle is meant to do is help them coordinate to find bountiful kind of food sources. Having a stop signal that kind of lets other foragers know that the kind of food source at issue isn't bountiful is actually really important. And so, kind of wrapping up, we've seen that there's some reason to think that there are QEDs present in some primate and bee communication systems. And this kind of places a robust constraint on what the QED can be, right? It can't require much cognitive sophistication, right? Namely, it can't require more cognitive sophistication than what primates and bees have available to them. With all this kind of theoretical and empirical work laid out, let's now compare kind of two proposals for the QED must be. So first, kind of let me talk about kind of intentionalism about the question under discussion. So Craig Roberts herself has never really kind of laid out a metaphysics for the question under discussion, but she has made a lot of really suggestive remarks to suggest that this is kind of her view on things. So in this kind of view, a given question is the question under discussion, just in case every conversational participant mutually intends the goal of the discourse to be some goal. And as a result, their joint attention is guided towards information that is relevant towards satisfying that goal. Now notice that the kind of account here has two tiers, right? So the first tier captures what we've been calling kind of relevance determination. In this case, that's kind of established by like what conversational participants intend their conversation to achieve. And the second tier captures what we've been calling publicity, right? In this case, that's because conversation participants are mutually kind of attending to information based on what they're intending to accomplish. Now this account has much going for it, right? It satisfies reducibility, publicity, and relevance quite nicely, right? Because it reduces kind of the question of discussion, facts about intentions and joint attention. Also, the idea that kind of intentions can guide attention is well attested. And it also fits in with the kind of broader Bayesian program, precisely because it kind of explains facts about communication in terms of intentions. But given what we've said so far, kind of there's a big problem kind of looming. It's already controversial that whether primates have intentions of the sort that would be needed here, right? So Richard has some nice work looking at whether primates can have communicative intentions. It's decidedly not controversial that bees lack the capacity to form intentions. And here's one reason why. Intentions are kind of conceptual motivational states, right? They require a subject to have concepts for what it would take to satisfy them. So for example, it's hard to form an intention to buy an iPhone if you don't have a concept for iPhones. But the crucial thing is that bees have kind of highly limited conceptual repertoires, right? It's not super obvious that they have concepts in the same way humans do. And so it's not super obvious that bees have intentions, let alone intentions for the QEDs. And so what we have here is a counterexample, right? Bees have QEDs, they don't have intentions, so QEDs can't require or be reduced to intentions. And notice that it'd be nice to kind of have a view that keeps the appeal of intentionalism without running into this counterexample, right? Precisely because it kind of did a nice job of satisfying our other desiderata. And so that's where I'll turn to next. Beforehand, let me just introduce some kind of terminology. Interrogative attitudes are attitudes like curiosity, wonder, and deliberation. So here, kind of looking at kind of data point 2, right? You can be curious about whether it's raining. You can wonder how it's raining. You can then deliberate why it's raining. And interrogative attitudes are kind of distinctive in at least two ways. So one is that they kind of take questions, not propositions, as their content. And two, and more importantly, they're kind of taken to play a big role in motivating and structuring inquiry. And this comes out of kind of Jan Friedman's work, Dennis Wickham's work, and a lot of the recent literature on inquiry. And my goal is to use these attitudes to reduce the question under discussion. So on the picture I want to propose, a given question is the question under discussion, just in case every conversational participant usually holds an interrogative attitude towards a certain question. And as a result, their joint attention is guided towards information that is relevant to answering that question. Now notice the second tier is basically the same. All we've changed is the first tier in two ways. So one thing is that we're not requiring subjects hold identical kind of interrogative attitudes. And this is to allow cases where one conversational participant is curious, one conversational participant is deliberating, but nonetheless kind of they share the same QED. Second, and more obviously, we've kind of replaced intentions with interrogative attitudes. And the reason for this is that they're well suited to kind of play that same theoretical role. Just like intentions, they're well known to kind of guide intention in both humans and non-humans. So George Lowenstein, Celeste Kidd, also recent dissertation, kind of nice introductions to this. And so our desiderata are kind of still satisfied, right? We can still have reducibility, publicity, and relevance. And while we've given up kind of Griceanism itself, because we're no longer thinking about things in terms of intentions, we still have a kind of neo-Gricean view on which we're kind of still reducing facts about communication to facts about psychology. The crucial bit is that interrogativism isn't subject to the counterexample from earlier. And the reason is, while bees don't have intentions, they do exhibit curiosity, right? So for example, there's evidence that suggests that foragers will kind of keep hunting for food sources even after they found one. And so kind of the intuition there is that it's not instrumentally valuable to them to keep searching. And so they must be kind of intrinsically curious about what other food sources there are available. And indeed, curiosity is attested among a large host of animals, and even among kind of pigeons and worms. And so interrogative attitudes are kind of perfect for accommodating kind of our non-provisionality constraint, because attitudes like curiosity are present in bees and primates and across the animal kingdom. Also notice that we don't have to give up on intentionalism. So one thing we can kind of say is that some interrogative attitudes are formed intentionally. And so we can think about intentionalism as a special case in which questions under discussion are formed because subjects intend as much. I think this is a kind of plausible view for what the sort of thing that human adults tend to do. All we're saying is that this is not representative of what QEDs require. There's a worry to be had here, though. So consider a case like this, right? So suppose two people are kind of talking about a master's thesis. One person is talking about it because they're a big nerd and they're actually kind of curious about the stuff they're working on. The other person is just kind of a normal human being, but they're not curious. And so they're kind of just playing along to be a good friend. These cases seem to involve questions under discussion. So for example, what is a thesis topic? But my view can't handle them, right? It's not kind of plausible here that someone who's not interested in kind of the question holds an interrogative attitude, right? It's not obvious that they're curious or wondering or deliberating what the thesis topic is. In contrast, kind of intentionalism looks pretty good here, right? Maybe the QED is established because both people kind of intend to talk about the thesis just for different reasons. I think there's a kind of Stalnackerian solution to be had here, though. So here, let me introduce kind of two ways he kind of defines acceptance throughout his career. So in one definition, it's kind of this class of propositional attitudes. Kind of, a subject accepts a proposition if she believes, knows, supposes, hypothesizes, or grants that that proposition is true for some purpose or other. On another definition, though, acceptance is kind of own unique attitude where a subject kind of accepts a proposition just in case she kind of acts as if she believes it, even if she doesn't. And I think the second definition, in which acceptance is kind of its own unique attitude, can kind of get us out of our worry here. And here's how, right? Let's coin a new interrogative attitude called entertainment. So here's kind of a first pass definition, right? A subject entertains a question, just in case she acts as if she's curious about that question. These seems kind of well motivated, right? Just in the same way kind of subjects act as if certain information is true for the purposes of conversation, we can kind of act as if a certain question is interesting for the purposes of conversation. So for example, you might act as if your boss's question is actually interesting because you don't want to lose your job. They can also naturally add the subjects kind of intentionally entertain questions, much in the same way they kind of intentionally hold other interrogative attitudes. And so there we can kind of have a plausible story for what's happening in a case like thesis, right? What's happening is that, one person is kind of entertaining a question for the sake of being a good friend. Another person's just kind of intrinsically curious. And by kind of the account we've given thus far, they can still have a question under discussion between them. And so we no longer have that kind of counterexample. I've run through a lot and I think I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to deliver some very quick concluding remarks. The first is that there's some loose ends here. So other posits and dynamic pragmatics also don't have an available reduction yet. So this is Paul Portner's to-do list here. Farkas and Bruce's table model kind of goes in here. And so it'd be nice to know what kind of psychological mechanisms they're helping us model, if at all. Also, kind of dynamic pragmatics kind of tends to model speech acts in terms of their updates to discourse, as I mentioned earlier. And it can be worth exploring whether this kind of approach is kind of right. My hunch is not, for reasons I'm happy to get into. And whether kind of reducing the question under discussion and other posits can help us model speech acts. And there my hunch is, yeah, I think so. Finally, kind of one under discussed feature of kind of the dynamic pragmatic tradition is how much it's influenced by Stalnaker's dispositionalism. So dispositionalism is the view that have a mental state, just to be willing to kind of be disposed to act as if certain information is true, or just to kind of act in kind of certain characteristic ways. So this is kind of easiest to see with acceptance, where kind of we define acceptance in terms of what kind of you're disposed to act as if you believe. Our discussion kind of departed from that in several ways. In principle, one could give kind of a representationalist account, pretensions, curiosity, deliberation, and so on. And so it can be worth exploring whether this dispositionalism is ultimately kind of an optional commitment when we model using kind of the common ground, the question, discussion, and so on. To put the point in another way, I think it's kind of an open question whether dynamic pragmatics really does require kind of the sort of dispositionalism that Stalnaker assumes. And with that's all I have. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Great, and now we move on to Q&A. If there are questions here in the room or online. Now I've got something that's not really a well-formed question, but it's this very half-baked. I'm not exactly sure what to say about it, but let me just sort of rant for a bit, and then you could sort of filter some decent.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I was just amazed by the idea of applying the QUD model to bees. So I was like, there's something that's got to be wrong here. So I was thinking, you know, if you were to drop some of the Canberra commitments and just produce some alternative notion of ground, right? Where you're no longer talking about common knowledge, but you're talking about common beliefs, say. And so you mentioned, you know, signal and systems and so on. I was like, well, what if Peter cries wolf, right? That should certainly produce some. So the thought is, right, when Peter cries wolf, even if he's misleading the other animals in the pack or whatever it is, there's a question under discussion whether there's a predator there or not, right? So I'm just shopping for this kind of non-factive notion of question under discussion that could perhaps account for sort of natural behaviors. I don't know, like, when animals fight and they feign certain kind of posture. And so I was just wondering exactly what that does to your idea that you seem to have. So first, right, this would make the bees stuff not apply, right? Secondly, when it comes to sort of primates or something like that, you'd expect that questions under discussion don't need to, well, I mean, this discussion can float free of the world, so to speak. Right? And the reason, and so here's, you know, I'm going to wrap up sort of in a way. So the thought is, right, one particular appeal that this model had was back in the day when people thought it could model theory change. And so you don't want to assume that those theories were all true. You could assume they were all false, right? But still there were some questions under discussion, the answers to which need not be true to the world, so to speak. Yeah, and so I'm going to stop there. I realize that's very Well, it's pretty much everywhere, but yeah. So I just wondered what you think about that stuff.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's super interesting. So the thought something like, okay, look, really, bees? Um, and in particular, like the worry seems to be something like whatever notion of question or discussion or common ground here we want seems kind of we want it to be non-factive to kind of explain kind of theory change or cases where kind of a speaker is misleading another speaker, whether it be in a bee signaling system or in like a more human case. Is that kind of the thought here? Yeah.
Sure.
Um, so I think there, my kind of initial reaction is to kind of say, just in the same way we kind of like allow a range of attitudes to kind of form the question or discussion, right? Whether it's curiosity or sometimes like intentions to inquire. We might want to kind of have that sort of flexibility for kind of the notion of ground. And so, for example, for like bees, whatever kind of propositional attitude it's kind of natural to ascribe to them, um, you know, whatever that ends up being, um, that would kind of be the sort of thing you want to kind of require. But then you can allow that for cases like humans, where we can kind of engage in kind of active misleading of each other. The common ground can be formed by more kind of complicated kind of propositional attitudes, and it can involve more complicated like mind reading mechanisms. Um, and so I guess to kind of answer your question, just in the same way you kind of can ask interesting questions about where and why QEDs can differ, you can kind of ask interesting questions about where and why common grounds differ. And yeah, you definitely don't want to require the common grounds be factive all the time, because that just seems to be a very bad prediction about how bees and like humans communicate. Is that kind of responsive to your concern?
So I'm not sure,
Mhm.
but it seems as though once you start trading in different notions of common ground,
Mhm. Mhm.
you're going to start trading in different notions of questions under discussion.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And what gets to count as an apt
Mhm.
answer to a question that's
Mhm.
under
Mhm.
discussion is similarly going to differ
Mhm.
if
Mhm.
that's going to allow for
Mhm.
answers that are
Mhm.
um, conceivable but not
Mhm.
possible, right? And
Right.
so whether what gets to count as conceivable or possible is
Mhm.
going to emerge from some kind of joint conceptual repertoire.
Mhm.
That it's exactly what's going to count as joint attention there is going to.
Right. Yeah. It's gonna matter a lot. Yeah. Yeah. So that's totally right. And to some extent, the reason I didn't give an account of joint attention is just because, as far as I can tell, there is no consensus account of what joint attention is. But you're totally right that like I'm asking it to do very particular theoretical work here, and so the notion's going to have to be the sort of thing that kind of bees can have in the same sense humans have, for example. Um, and it, unfortunately, I just don't have a particularly plausible story to give there.
Great, yeah. Thanks so much for that.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
there's a bunch of very interesting stuff. Thanks for that. Let's see if there's some more questions, comments, rejoinders, either in the room or online. Oh, and Aga, did you have a question by any chance? Or I thought somebody here, I believe, saw there was a hand up, but if not, that's totally fine. Um, I think it wasn't a question, but that's okay. Thanks, Juan. Oh, okay. It wasn't. Great. Good. Other thoughts? Let me ask you some more. So if you could just move up to the Schwankler bit,
Mm-hmm.
right? The informativity stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
So yeah. Yeah, right. So this is what you're after
Mm-hmm.
here then would also be some kind of um, modified informativity, right?
Right.
Be-
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so that's going to deliver different notions of relevance. So
Mm.
really everything
Right.
changed I guess that's what I'm
Right.
saying.
Oh, right. Like once you allow the psychological state to change, like the relevant
Yes.
theoretical roles also change.
Yes.
Right,
And
right.
right. And so just as there's this nice distinction between
Mhm.
cognitive relevance and relevance in communication, right? Back in the day with Sperber and Wilson. So you could say that we could consider different notions of questions under discussion,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? According to how they're sort of represented by interlocutors. And so maybe, I mean, is there a fact of the matter about which questions are really under discussion, irrespective of whatever misapprehensions all
Mhm.
interlocutors could be under?
Mhm.
Or so is there this kind of distributed sort of inherently dialogical notion of questions under discussion that's in the offing here, or no? What do you?
Uh, uh, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about it. Um, so maybe this is going to be like a very half-baked answer. So the situation is one in which like people think that the question is one thing, but maybe the question or discussion is actually another thing. Is that kind of the thought?
Yep.
Um, yeah, so one thought is like we're still kind of engaging in a modeling enterprise, and so you could like do the cheap thing and just kind of idealize away those situations.
Mhm.
Um, Another thing you might say though is those situations might be really, really difficult to have because if like every conversational participant thinks that the question discussion is one thing, um, that kind of settles the fact of the matter. Because the question discussion, at least in this kind of picture, just is like a way of representing what their mental state say the question discussion is. Or put another way, like, yeah, sorry.
Well, you could say it's self-correcting, but if you say that, there's something to be corrected.
Right. Yeah, and I think those kinds of cases are like people often talk about like accommodation in the linguistics literature, where sometimes like a speaker will say something that asks us to presuppose something that we didn't previously presuppose. Um, so for example, like when someone says like, "Oh yeah, like my desk has water on it," but we were kind of presupposing that there was a desk there. There's a kind of like you kind of just accommodate that presupposition right away. Um, you might think that something similar is happening there, where kind of like there was one question or discussion, and then it kind of got accommodated to a different one. Um, Accommodation is, as one linguist put it, a kind of creature of darkness. Um, no one has a particularly good grip on how it works or why it works. It kind of just does. Um, and so to some extent, I think I'm going to have to appeal to that creature of darkness here. You're right that these cases happen. It's just not altogether clear at kind of present what that kind of the right solution for them is. So I'm sorry I don't have anything more informative to say.
And just to sort of throw back to the 50s, I think R.M. Martin had this book on intentions, right? So you could have a bunch of common stuff, right? Common intentions, common belief, common, and you just, common reflection. You just go out and, go shopping for any attitude, and there's going to be some common version of everything. And it just sounded as though it might fit some of your project. But great. Thank you so much. Any last thoughts? And if not, please join me once again in thanking Juan. Thanks.
Thank you.